The crack of the slap was louder than the steady beeping of the ICU monitors. Margaret Kingsley stood there in her cream tweed suit, her pearls glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights, her face twisted in a mask of aristocratic fury. Adeline Wilson felt her head whip to the side, her long blonde hair a blur as the force of the blow sent her recoiling. Behind her, Dr. Samuel stood frozen, his hands raised in a useless plea for peace, his mouth agape in pure shock. Even Ethan, the man whose heart Adeline had just restarted, watched from his bed with wide, terrified eyes. Margaret didn't know that the nurse she had just struck was the only thing keeping the city from burning. She didn't know that the engagement ring Adeline kept tucked safely under her navy scrubs belonged to Leonardo Esposito, a man who didn't believe in forgiveness, only in debt and the interest paid in blood. In exactly 72 hours, Margaret Kingsley's world would be a pile of ash. Her reputation, her offshore accounts, and the family name she wore like armor would be dismantled with the surgical precision of a man who ruled the Italian underworld from the shadows. Margaret had made the one mistake you don't recover from in this city. She put her hands on the woman who owned the heart of the Don. But this isn't just a story about a mafia boss tearing a socialite apart. It's about what happens when the most dangerous man in the city is forced to choose between the monster he is and the man his wife wants him to be. By the end of this, you'll see why Margaret Kingsley is now a ghost in her own social circles, and why Leonardo Esposito, a man who usually solves problems with a shallow grave, chose a far more creative and permanent form of ruin. If this story pulled you in for even a second, kindly support me with likes, comments and also subscribe. It means the world to me. Now, let's go back to the moment the air in the room turned to ice. Adeline's cheek was burning, a vibrant red mark blooming against her pale skin. Margaret was still heaving, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for someone else to humiliate. The hospital security stood paralyzed. In this zip code, a Kingsley's checkbook was more powerful than a badge. But Enzo had already moved. Standing in the shadow of the doorway, Leonardo's most trusted enforcer had his hand tucked inside his tailored jacket. He wasn't reaching for a notepad. His face was drained of color, but not because of Margaret. He was looking at Adeline with a sense of impending doom. He had already sent the text. The one that simply read, "She bled." In the pocket of Adeline's scrubs, her phone vibrated once, then went silent. That was the signal. Leonardo was no longer asking questions. He was making calls. 8 minutes. That was all the time Margaret Kingsley had left as a member of the elite. Adeline looked at Enzo and shook her head slightly, a silent plea to keep the gun holstered. She had seen Leonardo destroy rivals before. She'd seen him erase a shipping magnate who tried to skim off the top. But he had never destroyed someone for her. That morning, over espresso, she'd laughed at his paranoia when he insisted Enzo follow her to the hospital. "It's a hospital, Leo," she'd said, smoothing her scrubs. "What's the worst that could happen?" She was about to find out that when you belong to the king of the city, the worst thing that can happen isn't the pain, it's the length he will go to make sure it never happens again. The scent of expensive espresso and toasted brioche filled the sun-drenched kitchen of Leonardo's penthouse, a sharp contrast to the sterile air Adeline knew awaited her. Leonardo sat across from her, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, looking more like a relaxed billionaire than the man who held the city's pulse in his hand. But his eyes, dark and observant, never truly rested. He watched Adeline as she checked her watch, her mind already shifting to the double shift ahead at St. Jude's Memorial. He reached across the marble island, his fingers grazing the back of her hand before sliding a small, velvet box toward her. Adeline paused, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. She didn't need to open it to know what was inside. It was a 5-carat pearcut diamond, a stone that captured the morning light and shattered it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. "Wear it today," Leonardo said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. It wasn't a command, but it carried the weight of one. Adeline sighed, offering him a soft, tired smile. "Leo, we've talked about this. I'm a trauma nurse. I spend my day in latex gloves and scrub pockets. I can't have a small fortune catching on a patient's gown or, worse, making me a target in the parking garage." Leonardo's jaw tightened, a subtle shift that Adeline had learned to read as deep-seated anxiety masked by pride. "It's not about the money, Adeline. It's about the name attached to it. People in this city know what that stone means. They know who you belong to. If they see that ring, they don't see a nurse they can talk down to. They see an Esposito. They see a line they cannot cross." "That's exactly why I can't wear it," she countered, standing up to rinse her plate. She walked over to him, leaning down to press a kiss to his forehead. "I want them to see a nurse. I want to earn their respect through the lives I save, not through the man I sleep next to. Besides, I have Enzo, don't I? Your shadow follows me everywhere." Leonardo stood, his hands finding her waist, pulling her into the firm heat of his chest. He looked down at her, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable for a moment. "Enzo is a ghost, Adeline. He stays in the corners. He can't stop a sharp tongue or a condescending look before it happens. That ring is a shield. Please, just for today. I have a bad feeling about the Kingsley boy being moved into your unit." Adeline laughed it off, tucking her blonde hair into a neat ponytail. She reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out a simple, thin silver chain. She slid the ring onto the metal and fastened it around her neck, tucking the heavy diamond beneath the V-neck of her navy blue top. "It's close to my heart, Leo. Isn't that enough?" He didn't answer immediately. He just adjusted her collar, ensuring the chain was completely hidden from view. "In my world, being hidden is a luxury. In yours, it's a risk. Just promise me you'll call if the air changes." "I'll be fine," she whispered, stepping out the door. She didn't see the way he watched her go, his hand already reaching for his phone to check Enzo's GPS coordinates. She didn't know that by hiding his mark, she had just walked into the lion's den without her armor. The sirens had barely ceased their wailing when the gurney carrying Ethan Kingsley burst through the double doors of the trauma bay. The air was thick with the smell of burnt rubber and expensive cologne, a reminder of the twisted metal wreckage he'd been pulled from. Adeline was in motion before the paramedics could even finish their report. She and Clara worked with a synchronized intensity, their hands moving through a blur of 4 starts, chest compressions, and shouted orders. Ethan was crashing, his heart stuttering under the trauma of a high-speed impact, but Adeline remained the eye of the storm. "He's in V-fib. D-fib at 200. Adeline's voice was sharp, cutting through the chaos. Clara moved with her, charging the paddles. The room seemed to hold its breath as Ethan's body jolted under the current. After an agonizing silence, the monitor let out a rhythmic, steady chirp. His heart was beating again. Adeline exhaled, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted his oxygen mask, but the victory was short-lived. The doors swung open again, but this time it wasn't a medical team. Margaret Kingsley marched in, her heels clicking like a countdown on the linoleum floor. She looked at her son, then at the 2 nurses, her eyes narrowing with a disdain that felt like a physical weight. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice dripping with the entitlement of the ultra-wealthy. "Where is the chief of surgery? I was told this was a premier facility, yet I find my son being handled by staff." Mrs. Kingsley, I'm Adeline Wilson, the lead trauma nurse. We've just stabilized Ethan, Adeline said, keeping her tone professional despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. He's been through a severe accident, and right now. I don't care who you think you are, Margaret snapped, stepping into Adeline's personal space. The smell of her floral perfume was suffocating. You look like you've barely finished school. I want a vetted doctor, someone with a pedigree, not a girl in wrinkled scrubs playing God with my son's life. Get your hands off him. Adeline stood her ground, her back straight. Ma'am, with all due respect, I am the one who just saved his life. He needs immediate monitoring, not a debate about credentials. Margaret's face turned a mottled shade of red. The idea that a common nurse would dare to speak back to her in front of witnesses was the final spark. You insolent little girl, she hissed. Before Clara could even gasp, Margaret's hand flew out. The slap was calculated and cruel. The heavy diamond rings on Margaret's fingers caught Adeline's cheek, the metal tearing into the skin near her jaw. Adeline's head snapped back, the world spinning for a split second as the metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. The ICU fell into a deathly silence. Margaret didn't look remorseful, she looked satisfied, as if she had simply swatted a fly. She didn't notice Enzo standing in the shadows, his eyes turning into chips of black ice as he reached for the phone that would end her life as she knew it. Adeline staggered back, her hand flying to her throbbing jaw where the heat of the impact was already turning into a dull, pulsing ache. Margaret Kingsley stood her ground, smoothing the front of her tweed jacket as if she had just finished a tedious chore. The silence in the trauma bay was absolute, broken only by the frantic chirping of the heart monitor attached to the very son Adeline had just pulled back from the brink of death. Consider that a lesson in place and priority, Margaret sneered, her voice trembling with a terrifying kind of calm. You do not speak to me. You do not look at me. You simply do as you are told. From the periphery of the room, a figure moved. Enzo, who had spent the entire morning blending into the institutional beige of the hospital walls, stepped into the light. His presence was sudden and heavy, like a storm front rolling in over a clear sky. He didn't look at Margaret. He didn't even look at the shocked hospital staff. His eyes were fixed entirely on the crimson smear on Adeline's cheek. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a phone, the screen already glowing. Without a word, he stepped past the paralyzed security guards and held the device out to Adeline. His expression wasn't one of anger, it was something far worse. It was the look of a man who knew he was about to witness a massacre. Adeline took the phone with trembling fingers. She didn't have to check the caller ID. Leo, she whispered, her voice cracking. Put it on speaker, Adeline. The voice that emerged from the phone didn't sound like the man who had kissed her forehead 3 hours ago. It was cold, hollow, and final, the sound of a closing casket. The entire room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret Kingsley tilted her head, a confused, arrogant smile playing on her lips, unaware that she was listening to her own eulogy. To the woman who just struck my fiancé, Leonardo's voice continued, vibrating through the small speaker with a terrifying clarity. You have 60 minutes. 60 minutes to hold your son's hand, to call your lawyers, and to pray to whatever God you believe in. Use this time wisely, because when I walk through those hospital doors, the world you think you own will cease to exist. Who is this? Margaret demanded, her voice finally wavering. Is this some kind of joke? Do you have any idea who my husband is? I know exactly who he is, Leonardo replied, and for the first time, there was a hint of a dark, predatory silkiness in his tone. And by sunset, he will be a man who possesses nothing but a very expensive suit and a wife he wishes he'd never met. 60 minutes, Margaret. The clock is already ticking. The line went dead. Adeline looked at the blank screen, then up at Margaret, whose face had finally begun to lose its color. Enzo gently took the phone back from Adeline's hand, his gaze shifting to the wall clock above the crash cart. "I'd suggest you find a seat, Mrs. Kingsley," Enzo said softly, his hand returning to the inside of his jacket. "The Don doesn't like to be kept waiting, and he's never been late in his life." The 60 minutes had not yet expired when the atmosphere in the hospital lobby shifted from clinical efficiency to a suffocating, heavy silence. The automatic glass doors slid open, and Leonardo Esposito stepped through, flanked by a presence that felt less like a legal team and more like an execution squad. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the light around him, his stride slow and deliberate. To his right was Matteo, his second-in-command, whose eyes scanned the room with a predator's detachment. To his left was Rose, a woman in a razor-sharp pinstripe suit carrying a leather briefcase that contained the power to unmake empires. As they moved toward the elevators, the usual bustle of the hospital died away. Staff members pulled back against the walls, instinctively sensing the arrival of a force that didn't belong in a place of healing. By the time the elevator reached the ICU floor, Helena, the hospital administrator, was already waiting at the doors. She had been summoned by frantic security guards, and her face was a pale mask of sweat and professional panic. She knew exactly who Leonardo was. Everyone in the city's upper echelons knew that the Esposito name was a word spoken only in whispers. "Mr. Esposito, please," Helena stammered, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "We are doing everything we can to resolve this misunderstanding. There is no need for this level of intrusion. The hospital has protocols for patient-staff conflicts." Leonardo didn't stop walking. He didn't even look at her. He simply kept his gaze fixed on the doors to Ethan Kingsley's room. Helena was forced to scurry alongside him, her heels clicking frantically to keep pace with his long, predatory strides. "Protocols?" Rose asked, her voice as smooth and cold as polished glass. She didn't look up from the tablet she was tapping. "Is it hospital protocol to allow a donor's wife to physically assault a lead trauma nurse while your security stands by? Because according to our initial review of your bylaws, and your recent tax filings, St. Jude's has far more to worry about than a misunderstanding." Helena's breath hitched. She looked at Matteo, who offered a thin, mirthless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The Don isn't here to discuss bylaws, Helena," Matteo said quietly. "He's here for his heart. And I suggest you stay very far away from him while he finds it." When Leonardo reached the ICU bay, he stopped. His eyes immediately found Adeline, who was standing by a workstation, the dark bruise on her cheek now a vivid, angry purple. Margaret Kingsley was sitting nearby, still trying to maintain an air of regal indifference, though her hands were trembling in her lap. Leonardo didn't shout. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply looked at Adeline, and for a fleeting second, the ice in his eyes thawed into a painful, raw tenderness. Then, he turned his gaze toward Margaret, and the room grew so cold that Adeline could almost see her own breath. The king had arrived, and the reckoning had begun. Leonardo didn't offer a greeting. He simply tilted his head toward a glass-walled consultation room, and his men moved like a silent tide, ushering Margaret, the cowering Helena, and a bewildered Dr. Samuel inside. The door clicked shut, sealing out the hospital noise and replacing it with a tension so thick it felt like physical pressure. Leonardo stood by the window, his back to the room, while Matteo opened a sleek, leather-bound folder on the mahogany table. "You've spent a lot of time cultivating the image of a philanthropist, Mrs. Kingsley," Matteo began, his voice devoid of emotion as he slid a series of bank statements across the table. The Kingsley Foundation has donated millions to this hospital. It's a beautiful story for the press. But our research, conducted in the last 40 minutes, tells a much darker tale. Margaret tried to summon her earlier bravado, though her hand trembled as she reached for the papers. This is harassment. My husband will have you. Your husband is currently watching his net worth evaporate, Matteo interrupted coldly. These documents show a complex web of shell companies. You aren't donating money, Margaret. You're laundering it. You've been using St. Jude's high-volume procurement accounts to move offshore capital back into your family's private equity firm. It's a federal crime, one that carries a 20-year sentence. And Helena here has been signing the intake forms. The hospital administrator let out a strangled sob, collapsing into a chair. Margaret's face went from indignant red to a ghostly, sallow gray. The diamond ring she had used to strike Adeline now looked like heavy, metallic shackles. Leonardo finally turned around. He leaned against the window frame, the late afternoon sun casting his face in deep shadow. I don't care about your money, Margaret. And I certainly don't care about your family's legacy. But you touched the only thing in this world that is holy to me. He stepped closer, his presence filling the room until Margaret was forced to shrink back. I could give this folder to the district attorney right now. By tonight, the Kingsley name would be synonymous with fraud, and your son would be recovering from his surgery in a prison ward. He paused, letting the weight of the threat sink in. But Adeline believes in mercy, even for those who don't deserve it. So, I am giving you a choice. Total, scorched earth ruin, where you lose your home, your freedom, and your son's future, or public penance. What do you want? Margaret whispered, her voice finally breaking. You will sign over your controlling interest in the hospital board to a trust in Adeline's name, Leonardo stated, his eyes like flint. You will issue a public apology for your unprofessional conduct, and you will personally fund a new trauma wing for those who cannot afford care. You will spend the rest of your life as a footnote in the story of the woman you tried to humiliate. If you refuse, I stop being a businessman and I start being the man they tell stories about in the dark. Choose. The next 48 hours were not a sequence of events so much as they were a controlled demolition. While Adeline returned to the quiet rhythm of the hospital, her cheek carefully bandaged, Leonardo watched from his office as the Kingsley empire began to bleed. The destruction was bloodless but absolute, executed through the flick of a pen and the clicking of keys in the hands of Rose and Matteo. By the first morning, the social foundation of Margaret's life was the first to crumble. A leaked, anonymous, tip regarding the hospital's financial discrepancies hit the board of the Metropolitan Museum. Before she could even finish her morning tea, Margaret received a courier-delivered letter informing her that her presence was no longer required on the board. The invitation to the season's most exclusive gala was rescinded by noon. In the world Margaret lived in, social death was the precursor to the real thing. By the 24-hour mark, the legal immunity that had protected Ethan Kingsley for years vanished. Leonardo's reach extended into the precinct where the DUI report had been misplaced. Suddenly, the files reappeared with undeniable clarity. Ethan was officially charged while still in his hospital bed, 2 officers stationed outside his room as he became a ward of the state rather than a prince of privilege. The look of sheer disbelief on his face when he was read his rights was the first time the Kingsley boy had ever understood the concept of consequence. As the second day drew to a close, the final blow came from within Margaret's own circle. Catherine, her oldest rival and a woman who had spent decades waiting for a crack in the Kingsley armor, moved in with predatory grace. With the family's offshore accounts frozen and their stock in freefall, Catherine spearheaded a hostile takeover of the Kingsley real estate holdings. By sunset, the keys to the Kingsley estate, the sprawling mansion that Margaret viewed as her throne, were being transferred to a woman who had loathed her since finishing school. Margaret sat in a sterile waiting room, her designer suit wrinkled and her pearls feeling like a noose. She watched the news ticker at the bottom of the television screen as it announced the restructuring of her life. She was no longer a queen, she was a cautionary tale. She had thought she was striking a nameless nurse, but in reality, she had struck the detonator to her own existence. Leonardo had kept his promise, he didn't kill her. He simply made sure she had nothing left to live for, while the woman she had assaulted prepared to build something new from the wreckage. The penthouse was silent, save for the low hum of the city breathing 60 stories below. Leonardo stood on the balcony, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the glittering skyline of the metropolis he controlled. When Adeline stepped out, her scrubs replaced by a silk robe, she saw the tension in his shoulders, the posture of a man who was still at war, even when the battle seemed won. He didn't turn around when she approached. "Matteo is waiting for the final word," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "The Kingsleys are ruined, Adeline. They are penniless, disgraced, and broken. But that doesn't fix the fact that she put her hands on you. In my world, a debt like that isn't settled with bank accounts. It's settled with a permanent silence." Adeline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his. His skin was cold, his grip iron-tight. "You have a hit out on her, don't you?" Leonardo finally looked at her, his eyes dark with a protective rage that had yet to burn out. "I cannot let the world think they can touch you and continue to breathe. I am a sword, Adeline. If I don't strike, the blade loses its meaning." Adeline looked out at the city, seeing the thousands of lights, each one representing a life, a family, a story. She thought of the hospital, the underfunded clinics in the lower districts, and the people who suffered because of the greed of families like the Kingsleys. "If you kill her, Leo, you just become another tragedy this city has to swallow," she said softly, turning to face him. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, compelling him to see her, not as a victim to be avenged, but as a woman with a vision. "I don't want a headstone for Margaret Kingsley. I don't want her blood on my hands or yours. That's not justice, it's just more darkness." Leonardo's brow furrowed. "Then what do you want?" "She took your dignity in front of your peers." "I want to heal the city, not bury its enemies," Adeline replied, her voice gaining strength. "Instead of a hit, use those resources to build. Take the Kingsley land, their frozen assets, and your own influence. Build a sanctuary. A trauma center in the heart of the city that doesn't care about pedigrees or checkbooks. A place where nurses are respected and patients are safe. Give me a clinic, Leo. Give me a place where we can turn your power into something that breathes life back into people." For a long moment, Leonardo remained still, the predator in him warring with the man who loved her. Slowly, the tension left his frame. He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "You are going to be the ruin of my reputation," he whispered, though the edge of his voice had softened into something resembling awe. "No," Adeline smiled, pulling him closer. "I'm going to be the making of your legacy." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and sent a single word to Matteo: "Abort." The Queen had made her choice, and for the first time in his life, the Don realized that mercy was a far more devastating weapon than gold or lead. 6 months later, the morning air was crisp as the sun glinted off the glass and steel of the newly christened Kingsley Wilson Sanctuary. The building sat on the very land that had once served as a private club for the city's corrupt elite, now transformed into a beacon of hope for the forgotten. There were no cameras, no red carpets, and no socialites vying for attention. Instead, there was the quiet, purposeful hum of a medical facility built to endure. Leonardo stood in the lobby, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the staff move with a sense of pride that money couldn't buy. He had traded his charcoal suits for something less imposing, though the authority he radiated remained absolute. Beside him, Matteo held a clipboard, finalizing the security details that would ensure this ground remained sacred, untouched by the politics of the underworld. Adeline was already in her element, her navy scrubs replaced by a clean white coat with her name embroidered in silver. She didn't look like the woman who had been struck in an ICU half a year ago, she looked like a woman who had finally stepped into her crown. The sliding doors hissed open, and the sanctuary's first patient was rushed in. It was a young girl, no older than 7, her face pale and her breathing shallow following a hit-and-run in one of the city's neglected districts. The ambulance driver looked hesitant, accustomed to hospitals that asked for insurance before providing oxygen. "Bring her to Trauma 1, Adeline commanded, her voice steady and clear. As she worked over the child, Leonardo watched from the observation window. He saw Adeline's hands, the same hands that had stopped him from taking a life, now fighting with everything they had to save one. There was no fear in the room, only a fierce, concentrated mercy. When the girl finally squeezed Adeline's finger, a small gasp of air returning to her lungs, the tension in the room broke like a fever. Adeline stepped out of the trauma bay minutes later, her forehead damp with sweat but her eyes shining. She walked straight to Leonardo, leaning into him as he wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders. "You were right," he whispered, looking down at the child being moved to a recovery ward. "This is more devastating than any bullet. You've taken their hate and turned it into a debt the city can never repay." "It's not about the debt, Leo," she replied, looking up at him. "It's about proving that the shadow you cast can be used to keep people cool, not just keep them in the dark." In that moment, the sanctuary wasn't just a hospital, it was the physical proof of their union. The Don had provided the walls, but the nurse had provided the soul. As the next ambulance siren wailed in the distance, they both knew the work was just beginning. The golden hour light draped over the Lake Como-style estate like a velvet shroud, turning the deep blue of the water into shimmering liquid copper. Wisteria hung heavy from the stone balconies of the Esposito ancestral villa, the air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the salt of the sea. It was a scene of impossible elegance, where the two halves of Adeline's life finally merged into one. On one side of the aisle, her fellow nurses and her modest family stood in awe of the grandeur, on the other, men in sharp, dark suits, the silent architects of the city's order, bowed their heads in respect. Adeline moved down the petal-strewn path with a grace that silenced the room. Her gown was a masterpiece of Italian lace, but it was the radiant confidence in her eyes that held everyone captive. She no longer looked like the vulnerable nurse who had been struck down in a sterile ICU, she looked like a woman who had mastered the storm. At the altar, Leonardo stood waiting, his usual mask of cold indifference completely shattered. As she reached him, he took her hands, his grip firm and grounding. The ceremony was a blend of tradition and new beginnings. When it came time for the vows, Leonardo didn't reach for a prepared script. He looked directly into Adeline's eyes, his voice carrying across the terrace with a clarity that made the seasoned soldiers in the audience shift uncomfortably. "I have spent my life learning how to take things apart," Leonardo said, his voice low and steady. "I was raised to be a weapon, to find the weakness in every structure and exploit it. I thought power was the ability to instill fear. Then I met you." He squeezed her hands, his thumb tracing the scar on her cheek that was now almost invisible. "You showed me that there is a greater strength in rebuilding what is broken. You didn't just save my life, you gave it a purpose beyond the shadows." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her, yet audible in the profound silence. I will always be the sword that defends your honor and the wall that stands against your enemies. But you, Adeline, will always be the shield. You are the mercy that tempers my rage and the light that guides my hand. I am yours, in this life and the next. As they were pronounced husband and wife, the estate erupted in a roar of celebration that echoed across the lake. During the first dance, as the orchestra played a soft Italian melody, Adeline rested her head against Leonardo's chest. She felt the steady, calm beat of his heart, a heart she had healed in more ways than one. From a slap that was meant to break her, they had built a sanctuary. From a moment of hatred, they had forged an eternal vow. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Adeline realized that justice wasn't just about what you destroyed, it was about the beautiful world you had the courage to build from the ashes. We've watched Margaret Kingsley lose everything because she thought her status made her untouchable. We've watched Leonardo Esposito choose a hospital wing over a hit. But the real heart of this story isn't the wealth or the mafia power, it's the choice Adeline Wilson made in that ICU. Think about that moment for a second. You've just saved someone's life, and in return, you're met with a slap that draws blood. You have the most dangerous man in the city on speed dial, ready to erase your problems with a single word. Most people would have let Leonardo do his worst. They would have watched the Kingsley empire burn and felt justified in every flickering flame. But Adeline didn't. She realized that while revenge is a quick burn, purpose is a slow build. She turned her trauma into a sanctuary for others. So, I have to ask you, what would you have done if you were standing in Adeline's scrubs? If you had that kind of power backing you up, would you have let the Don handle it his way, or would you have fought to keep your own hands clean? Is there such a thing as fair revenge, or does mercy always carry more weight in the end? Maybe you've been in a situation where someone looked down on you because of your job, your background, or the way you look. Maybe you didn't have a Leonardo Esposito to step in, but you had to find a way to keep your head high anyway. Drop a comment below and let me know. If you were Adeline, would you have stopped the hit on Margaret, or was the social ruin not enough for you? Have you ever faced a Margaret Kingsley in your own life? How did you handle the disrespect? We read every single comment, and your stories of resilience are what keep us going. If you enjoyed this journey from the hospital floor to the Italian coast, make sure you've hit that subscribe button as it means a lot to me. Thank you.